in their brain than you do. But what happens is the brain grows, so the brain grows like a forest. And so when you're young, it's like an overplanted forest actually. And so all the neurons grow really, really fast. But they're not very well organized when you're young. And so when you're about 3, there's this massive, what they call pruning event that happens in your brain. And so you have all of these neurons, and then suddenly it's like someone comes in and thins the forest. So the neurons that are not being used when you're about 3 years old will die away. And that enables the other neurons in your brain to grow stronger. So if anyone in the room is a gardener, for example, this is like, I'm a gardener, so this is like growing tomato plants. So when you grow tomato plants or other plants in your garden, if you plant them too close together, it will stymie the growth of all the plants, right? So a lot of times, if you look on the seed packet will say plant them, and then after 2 weeks, thin them, right? And because when you thin them, so you plant many seeds, and then you thin the seeds, because that's just what the brain does as well, actually, is it grows lots of neurons, and then only the neurons that are being activated we want to keep around. The rest of them are just kind of wasted. So we prune back a bunch of our neurons when we're about 3. And the rest of the neurons grow and they're nurtured. And the pathways through you can imagine again in this forest analogy, in those next few years you're going to lay down certain pathways in your brain. And so just like you can transform something from a dirt road into a paved interstate highway or inter-province highway, you do that with your brain. So you'll have lots of weak connections, but as you use those pathways more and more, it's like they become cemented. So that's for good and bad, right? So pathways that are good, pathways that are associated with the executive control network, tend to be pathways you want to really secure well when you're learning and you're growing up, right? You can have too much executive control activity actually as well. So that can be a problem as well. So as you're maturing, you're laying down all these pathways. And then when you're about 25 years old is when your brain has reached peak maturity. You've not only laid down all the pathways and created a set of strong connections, but you've also done something called myelinating them. Okay? So you guys are a very educated audience, but just in case it's been a little while since you've been to school, right? So myelination is the process of essentially surrounding the axons of our neurons with coating. And that coating, which we call glia, helps information flow down the neuron. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a second. But glia is very important. And this all happens when you're about 25. And then unfortunately it's downhill from there. So at about 25, your brain will start to lose neurons slowly. But you obviously we all learn a lot after we're 25. So just because your brain will start to lose neurons doesn't mean that you can't learn new things. In fact, you super strengthen the pathways that are there, right? And this becomes, all the patterns that you'll do for a long time. So 25 years old, there's 100 billion cells in the brain. That's a huge number. It's about half of the number of stars in the galaxy. So that's pretty incredible, just in your brain. The speed at which information travels in your brain is about 560 kilometers per second. It's so fast. So speed is going back and forth incredibly fast. The reason I got interested in the brain, when I was in college, I played a lot of tennis. And I remember playing intramural tennis at college, and I would see this girl on the other side of the court. And I was amazed that I could look at this girl on the other side, and somehow my brain could figure out, based on watching her body and the ball coming towards my racket, shoulders at just the right rate, swing my racket at just the right incline to get my ball to go somewhere that I predict she's not going to be at the exact time that it lands. I mean, that's an incredible amount of computation that your brain does. And your brain does it like that. I grew up in a state where kids learn to play competitive tennis when they're very small. And so the fact that your brain can do that at such an early age is just amazing. And it can do it because information flows through these pathways very quickly. I talked about glia. So in fact, the majority of your brain is glia. And glia is fat. So it's good fat. So back to that breakfast analogy, would be a good way to rationalize why you should have another cookie. It's because maybe it will help your brain. So your brain is full of glia, and glia helps information flow from one place to another. In your brain itself, right now, there's enough electricity that's being generated to power a 20-watt light bulb. Now, 20-watt light bulb is like, maybe, actually these are pretty small, maybe like a little bit less than the intensity of this light bulb is being generated in your brain right now. So if we could somehow hook you up to a light bulb, it would light up. It's kind of cool to think about. Well, the reason I want to tell you that is, right, your brain is an electrical organ. And I don't know why we don't teach this as much in school, right? In school, when you learn about the brain, you learn about neurotransmitters, chemistry, and blood flow. But this electrical side of your brain, this network-based view of your brain, is equally as important. And so when we think about the brain itself, we can think about the brain as a chemical organ and the brain as an electrical organ. So this is a model of, basically a very simplified model of a synapse, right? We have neuron 1 over here. So this is the cell body of the neuron, and it's surrounded by dendrites, right? And then the information comes into the neuron through the dendrites, into the cell body, and then if the circumstances are sufficient, an action potential will happen, and information will flow down the axon all the way to the end, and then we have these synaptic terminals, and there's a space between here and here, and that space between neuron 1 and neuron 2 is called the synapse. And it's at the synapse that all the chemistry happens. So all the drugs and stuff that work on the brain are all working right here. None of them actually are working anywhere here. This part of the neuron is all electrical. And so there's ways that sometimes this neuron will kind of fire, will be in the right situation to fire, but problems happen down the line, like a traffic jam or an accident or something, and information doesn't actually get to the synapse. And that's all electrical. So this is why we call this an electrochemical organ, is that we have the electricity part, and then we have the chemistry part. And both are necessary in order for the brain to function in a healthy way. And if you have the right chemistry here at the synapse, then information will go back to these dendrites, and the circle and the cycle happens again. So when we think about this, we can think about the brain as electricity and chemistry. How do we treat a chemical imbalance in the brain? Well, we probably should think about the synapse, right? Because this is where the chemistry is happening. And so medications usually affect the synapse directly. These are things like serotonin, dopamine, glutamate agents, GABAergic agents. They're all working right here. And if this makes your head spin, it's intended to, all I want to show here is that this is an image of the synapse itself. This is called the synaptic junction. And there's so much happening here. So I went to PhD school for neuroscience, and we would spend an entire semester taking a class about this. And some people that specialize this, they would take an entire semester learning about this type of channel. And other people would spend an entire semester learning about that type of channel. So there's an incredible amount of knowledge about the synapse. Lots of complex things happening, and this is what pharma does. So all the medications, this is what they're talking about here. If we think about the medications that are present for brain diseases, they all work on a variety of things here. So for depression, we think about serotonin agents, right? SSRIs, SNRIs, ketamine. Do you guys do ketamine for depression here? Yes? Yeah. So ketamine, this is working on the glutamate channels. Anxiety, we tend to think about glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter of the brain. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. So anxiety medicines usually work by decreasing glutamate or increasing GABA. OCD, there's not a lot of great treatments, right? But serotonin tends to be a mechanism to go after. Schizophrenia. Try it. Psychosis treatment or something. Oh, it's fine. Yeah, if you can. Okay. Yeah. Oh, you're gonna do it for me? Amazing, thank you. Okay, so schizophrenia is dopamine, smoking cessation agents are glutamate quickly. Dementia, we think about acetylcholine, chronic pain, GABA and opiates, stroke recovery. In the US, there's no FDA cleared medications. I'm not sure for any stroke people in here. Does the Thailand FDA have stroke recovery medicines? So historically, we've thought a little bit about, certainly we treat the depression in stroke recovery, and then Parkinson's is dopaminergic agents as well. Next slide. But what happens, of course, with medications is that we're not delivering them directly to the brain. If we were delivering them directly to the synapses that are involved in that disorder, we wouldn't have side effects like we have. But because generally medications are swallowed, so they go through the GI system, they go through the liver, etc., they have first pass metabolism. And it's those off-target effects which actually are causing some of the side effects of the drug. Additionally, when the drug's chemistry gets into the brain, it hits all the synapses. So in the case of Parkinson's disease, for example, that's a dopamine problem, but it's a dopamine problem in the basal ganglia, which is kind of deep in the middle of your brain. It's not really a dopamine problem in the prefrontal cortex. But when you give a Parkinson's patient a dopamine agonist, what they found, one of the first side effects of a dopamine agonist, because it also hits the prefrontal cortex, was that patients were becoming very, their salience network was overactive. So you would have these like little old men with Parkinson's disease suddenly like wanting to go to a bar and wanting to go to a casino, and suddenly these little old men with some of the dopamine agonists, not levodopa, but dopamine agonists, were becoming thrill seekers, which is kind of a little bit silly, but not really great for them. Sometimes they would get in trouble. So, but that's because it was also affecting prefrontal cortex dopamine, not just the dopamine in the basal ganglia. Okay, so if you could click through them one at a time, that'd be great. So, and so these side effects that are from these medications are things like in depression, we have the inability to feel joy, nausea, anxiety. You can click through them all. This is just a list of them here. Right? These are common side effects for these medications. And one of the things that when I was putting this, when I was putting this slide together, was noticing how common nausea is. Nausea is listed in almost every one of them. And that's because you have to swallow it, right? That's as simple as the fact that you have to swallow the drug. And so it's going to affect your GI system. And we have a lot of things with sleep problems, etc. So if we could solve the problem, that if we could take pharmacotherapy and just target it to the brain network that was involved, it would revolutionize medicine, I think. And there are some very cool ways that maybe somebody as rich as Elon Musk could do at one point, but you'd have to be a risk taker to do them. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's great. So we talked about the chemistry and the side effects. Oh, that was fast. So what do we do if there's an electrical imbalance in the brain? So from an electrical perspective, the answer is brain sway. That's how you solve it. Sorry, I should have taken that part out of this one. So for the electrical balance, we want to use TMS in one place or another, right? So for TMS, it affects the axons and the dendrites themselves, so down here. How does TMS work? So I mentioned before, I have a more sciencey slide about electromagnetic induction. And I told you before, it's sort of based on this right-hand rule. It was developed by a gentleman known as Michael Faraday in approximately the 1960s. And he did these great experiments in England where he demonstrated that electricity generates magnetism and magnetism generates electricity. And then several other influential people kind of made that more and more a part of everyday living. So all kinds of machines that you use rely on electromagnetic induction. One of which is in your pocket right now, perhaps. So my favorite example right now, which is very good if you're giving TMS to patients, by the way, is to describe TMS like a phone charger. So a lot of us have a wireless charger for your phone. A lot of times they look like a little coaster. And in that coaster, if you were to open the coaster up, you would see that inside it's a very simple coil. So it's just one wire that comes down, and then it goes like in a circle. And we know that because of this, there's a magnetic field that comes out this way, right? So the winding goes this way, the magnetic field comes out of the board. And when we turn this on and off, so we pulse it, and the electricity in the wall is pulsing at a certain frequency. So when this electricity pulses, the magnetic field goes on and off, on and off. And your phone is set up to receive or be sensitive to that electromagnetic pulse. And so that's what restores energy. The analogy for TMS is that just like when your phone, in fact, we could have wirelessly charged this maybe. So just like when your phone is low on battery, so it's low energy state, you can place it under this charger, and with no wires at all, completely non-invasively, it restores energy to the phone. It restores energy to the phone, right? So that's amazing. In fact, you can actually, if you have a good charger, you can actually raise your phone a little bit above the charger. You should try this at home, especially if you have like a kid and you want to get them excited about science. You can raise it a little bit above the coaster and it will still work. Now if you raise it too much, if you increase the distance too much, then it won't work unless you have a really powerful charger. That's going to be important for TMS. In the same way for TMS, if you have depression, we know you have low glucose metabolism or low energy in several of these brain networks. And what we can do is through the same process of electromagnetic induction, we can restore blood flow and energy in the form of ATP. So we can basically restore energy to those circuits themselves. So it's a really good, I like to use that with all kinds of people I teach because it's like right there in our pockets and it makes it not feel as scary, right? right? Like, oh, I know a wireless charger. Like, it's not scary. So it's a nice way to talk about it. And so when we think about how TMS works on the neuron, it's going to work here at the level of the axon itself. So in fact, actually, if this axon was bending, you may remember, so your brain is actually all folded, right? So you have all these gyri and sulci. Everybody's brain folding pattern is unique, and in fact, it's more unique than your fingerprint. So in some like terrible dystopian era, that's how they'll identify us. It's not our like fingerprint, but our folding of our brain. So everyone is unique. And it's at these bend points where the axons are like bending, arching over the gyrus, because it's all folded together. That's where the magnetic field is going to work the most, right? Because electromagnetic induction requires bending. So when this axon is bent, it's most susceptible to TMS. And what TMS will do is it will cause something called an action potential, which you guys will see this afternoon, when that's what's happening when we place the TMS coil over your motor cortex of your hand and will cause a contraction in your hand. That's these neurons are receiving information from the coil, and there's a threshold for stimulation. They're becoming depolarized, and when they're depolarized, information flows down the axons. And in your primary motor cortex here, we have a bunch of neurons, and then they go down to the corticospinal tract here, and like my arm up here, and then there's one synapse, right? So in the spinal cord itself, there's one more neuron, and then it goes out to my hand. It's just actually it's just this very simple 2-neuron thing that makes your hand fire, except they fire in bundles. So lots of complex things are happening here, and there's lots of all kinds of problems, demyelinating diseases, lots of diseases that can interrupt what happens here. And this is why there's so many different TMS protocols. So for some of you in the room that have more experience with TMS, this is why the dynamics of frequency and voltage and timing that are required for information that comes into dendrites to make it all the way through to the synapse. This is why there's so many different ways to help treat diseases in theory. Some protocols are what's called 20 hertz, so that'll be pretty fast, so 20 times per second. And you can hear the electromagnetic pulse, that's why we call it a pulse. So 20 hertz would go, but then there's some protocols that are 1 hertz. And when you hear the machine, Jonathan will probably play the machine for you, so you'll get to hear what it sounds like. That's what you're hearing. It's that the energy is coming through at a different rate, or at a different power, or at a different intensity and spacing. Something called theta burst is another thing. So there's lots of smart people that think about this, just like there's lots of smart pharma people that think about neurochemistry. There's lots of smart electricity people that think about solutions on this side. And I used to teach continuing medical education classes for TMS. We would spend about 3 days learning about in depth about each of these different parameters. And when I would teach it, I would teach this acronym here called fields. So these are the primary domains that affect how TMS is going to work. The frequency, so like I just described, it could be high frequency, 20 hertz, or low frequency, 1 hertz. Intensity, usually that's judged on something called the percentage of the motor threshold. So your motor threshold is defined as the minimum intensity required to make your hand move 50% of the time. So sometimes we stimulate above that therapeutically, and sometimes we go below that. Engagement, we also know that TMS seems to interact well with behavioral interventions. So for our behaviorists in the room, for OCD and for smoking cessation, if you have the person think about or get in a brain state that simulates craving if they're addicted, or simulates the anxiety associated with OCD, TMS works better. And this is this idea that a primed brain is a more plastic brain. So if, like, right now, hopefully, at least some of you are like, wow, this is really interesting. And some of you might be a little bit sleepy just because it's mid-morning and da-da-da-da. So if I did TMS on the people that are like really awake and engaged, it would work a lot better than the people that are a little bit sleepy. Which is why we don't want people to fall asleep when they receive TMS. So when you're delivering TMS, you want your patient to be awake and alert. Even if they're watching TV or they're playing on their phones, you want them to be engaged in something. Ideally, something related to getting healthier, some type of like cognitive behavioral training. The location of stimulation, this is sort of based on the different networks that we talked about before. That's obviously important. The distance and the depth. So just like that analogy where we have a wireless charger, if you have the wireless charger and you move it away, you move your phone away from the charger a certain distance, it's not going to work as well, right? And so that's true for TMS in the brain. If you have a TMS coil that's not as strong based on the shape, or doesn't go it's just shallow, doesn't go, it can go deeper if it's bent like these coils, because they're bent. But if it's just flat, like a plane, it's very shallow. And so if you have an older adult, for example, that has a lot of brain atrophy, as I said, so 25 years old is sort of all downhill from there. So as you get older, your brain starts to shrink. The older you get, the more likely the distance is going to be higher. And so you're going to want to make sure you are using a coil or a protocol that can hit the deeper areas. And then the number of sessions. So typically with TMS, I think we're starting to learn that more sessions is always better, but we didn't know that at first. And so some of our protocols just developed around the world. When I say our, I don't mean Brainsway, I mean the field's TMS protocols are very short. When I was running studies in my own lab, I wanted to get papers out quickly. And so I just wanted to do the minimum sessions I thought was necessary to observe a statistically significant finding. And so I would do maybe 15 sessions, which felt like a lot for me. But that might not be enough for the patient. So there's a lot of publications out there that were done, like People by Me, when we were in a university setting, where the session number is like 10 or 15. And as you're reading the literature, those publications may be significant, which is good, but what we're starting to learn is that more sessions is better. So generally it doesn't ever, I don't know, I'm not aware of any situation where more is worse. So I could be wrong, but for the most part, the more sessions you do, the patient either plateaus clinically or they get better clinically. Just something to keep in mind. So all of these parameters can be changed and tweaked with TMS. We have these 3 networks that I described before. One way when I'm talking to patients, because not everyone is interested, but some patients, they do want to understand what you're doing, right? And TMS can seem a little bit scary. Everybody's used to taking pills, and suddenly you're going to put a thing on their head. So I find that if I educate them and talk to them about what it is and what it's like, then there's more buy-in, like the relationship's a little better. If you are going to use TMS in your practice, I suggest you try it yourself. You don't have to have a diagnosis. I guess I don't know what the rules are in Thailand, but in the US for sure you could go sit under one. We probably have to have you all sign some authorization to do it today, but certainly I could go sit under there and you